The substance of Greek tragedy. Fire and time's injurious hand have spared, for our consideration, a very minute part of the mass of Greek literary criticism. The great centuries of Greece were singularly free from any theorizing about the principles or meaning of art and literature, for the artist was the humble and unquestioning servant of the state, active at the great public festivals or in adornment, in the building of the city's temples or on occasions of social union and enjoyment. It was only when the vitality of the city-state began to fail in the 4th century BC, and disintegrating forces made themselves painfully evident in public life, that Plato accused art of being one of those forces, preached the necessity of putting it in leading strings. The 4th century was the first to hear the deceptive and distracting message of art for art's sake, with all its isolating influence on the individual, and to witness the detachment of literature and sculpture from the service of the state, and their transformation into a grace or solace of private life. The middle comedy and the sculpture of Praxiteles mark the first stage in that journey by which art passed from being the common enjoyment of the whole people in national theatre or temple into the secret delight of the solitary reader or the private collector. Art might still serve to adorn temples and amuse a public gathered in the theatre of Dionysus, but the dignity and solemn and serious feeling which sprang from its union with the life of the state and religion had forever passed away. In that ample outpouring of a life's experience and reflection known as the Laws, Plato is still buoyed up with the thought that the small city-state is a possibility in Greek politics, while he was writing the power of Macedon was already established, threatening Greece with unmistakable fashion. Aristotle, who died little more than 20 years after Plato, still clings to the outworn forms of Greek political life, summarizing the achievements of the past for the instruction of future generations. And as in the great philosophical treatises, he traces the development of the Hellenic mind in ethics, politics, and metaphysics, so in the Poetics, and reflects upon the course of drama, and formulates certain rules and practices which the dramatist and tragedian in particular, for we no longer have his criticism of comedy, must observe if his work is to be successful. Even if the thought came to him that the Greek tragedy had attained the true fullness of growth, he gives no sign of recognizing that it was already moribund, and that even in his own lifetime, and for some time before, the plays publicly performed at Athens were either bloodless creatures formed of artificial rhetoric or tragedies from the great past galvanized for a moment by the art of the theatre into a second life. Brief and fragmentary, then, as Aristotle's book on poetry is, it is the only piece of criticism on a definite form of art which has come down to us from antiquity, composed by one who had spoken with men who had seen and known something of the greatness of Athens in the 5th century BC. Dionysius, Demetrius, and the author of the treatise on the Sublime are separated by centuries from the works which they discuss. Literary criticism had become a business in itself, and the feeling for the relationship of literature and life was hardly present at their minds. Now they concentrate too much on the verbal or formal perfection of the Greek writers, and break up that original unity of life and art which is the precious and unique quality of the creative artistic spirit of the 5th century BC. The preservation of Aristotle's criticism on any particular form of art is a piece of good fortune, and our sense of that good fortune is tremendously increased when the object of his criticism is Greek tragedy. For tragedy, which has attained such an astonishing position in European literature, is the peculiar creation of the Greeks. Epic and lyric poetry are found in the writings of the East. Architecture and sculpture achieved magnificent form long before the golden age of Athens. But tragic drama seems the distinctive flower of the Greek genius, into which all their other literary forms were gathered together, so it contains the splendors of epic narrative and the varying moods of lyric inspiration, blended into a vaster and deeper harmony than any one of those forms could have achieved by themselves, the symphonic poem of life. After the repulse of Persia from Greece in 479 BC, tragedy becomes the supreme form of literary art in Athens. He who reads the plays of Sophocles can hardly avoid feeling how natural it is that the youthful energy and lyric flights of an earlier and youthful age should pass away into this form of mature summer beauty. Tragedy is the final experience of life as something serious. Epic and lyric poetry may be conscious of that seriousness, but they are concerned chiefly with the slighter and more transient experiences of life, which are obscured or pass away with the years. Tradition relates that Aristotle wrote the Poetics after a preliminary study of 158 constitutions. How many tragedies he had seen or read before writing the Poetics is impossible to conjecture. During his long residence in Athens, he must have seen a very large number performed and have supplemented that experience by reading. We know that the three great tragedians wrote over 300 dramas in all. And when we recall the many other writers of the 5th and 4th centuries, some of them the most prolific, Aristotle, for instance, is credited with 240 plays. The full roll of tragedies must have been immense, more than any critic, however voracious his appetite, could possibly digest. If his reading was extensive, Aristotle makes no parade of it in the Poetics. In addition to Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, he mentions by name 7 or 8 other dramatists and about a dozen plays by the great three, which are no longer extant. And in harmony with this simple list of references and quotations is the simplicity of dramatic principle and structure which its criticism brings to light and approves as the most successful. Indeed, so simple are his requirements for a good tragedy that it is hard to avoid the surmise that Attic tragedy, except in the hands of a very great master, must have been a barren and uninteresting, flat, the rehearsal with the monotonous reiteration of an oppressive theme. In reading the Poetics, it is well to remember that Aristotle's purpose in writing is not only to set the criticism of tragedy on a sound basis, but also to help dramatic poets to write successful tragedies. Frequent references to Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus make it certain that he regarded that work as a model for tragedy, and the general tenor of his criticism shows that he felt Euripides at his best to be more tragic but less artistic dramatist than Sophocles. Modern criticism agrees with his estimate of Euripides, taking tragic in the sense of pathetic, but finds it much harder to understand the scarcity and frigidity of his references to Aeschylus. Aristotle seemed to have regarded Aeschylus in much the same manner as many critics in the 19th century regarded the so-called primitives in Italian painting, as being incomplete but necessary stages towards the midday splendor of the 16th century painting. No critic can free himself altogether from the general ideas and prejudices of his own day. The language, the long-drawn choric songs and superhuman portentous elements in the Aeschylean drama were as alien from the spirit of the 4th century as the poetry of Keats was from the minds of the Edinburgh reviewers, while dramatically the lack of action and absence of plot, the touchstone of dramatic success in Aristotle's view, would make him relegate Aeschylus to the position which he seems to occupy in the Poetics, of an important innovator and pioneer in the development of tragedy. Strictly then, the magnificence of Aeschylus' moral and religious ideas, the splendors of his imagination, may be said to fall outside the limits of aesthetic analysis, in which Aristotle has imposed upon himself, but it is hard to avoid the feeling that there is again the real reason of the omission lies in the insensibility of the 4th century, which Aristotle too shared to some extent, to that grandeur of vision from which Aeschylus' tragedies proceed. Nothing could be simpler or more comprehensive than Aristotle's definition of tragedy in the 6th century, or in the 6th chapter rather, of the Poetics. It is the representation of an action that is heroic, complete, and of a certain magnitude. By means of language enriched with all kinds of ornament, each used separately in the different parts of the play, it represents men and men in action. It does not use narrative, and through pity and fear effects relief to these similar emotions. This definition includes, without any pressing or stretching of its terms, dramas as different as in form and in spirit as the surplices of Aeschylus, the Oedipus Tyrannus, and Philoctetes of Sophocles, and those late plays of Euripides in which the heroic and serious atmosphere is properly maintained. Yet the explanations and amplifications which Aristotle gives in later chapters contradict the practice of the earlier age. His advocacy of the unhappy ending does not rest upon the Sophoclean form of tragedy, and his insistence upon the great importance of a well-constructed plot means something very different from the grandiose movement of an Aeschylean tragedy. It would seem as though his definition was based upon the drama of the 5th century, while his more detailed criticism took into account only the 4th century and contemporary work, when the love of classification, sharply defined types, had invaded the world of literature, and the development of Aristophanic comedy into the more sedate comedy of manners had compelled tragedy to take as its distinguishing mark a theme with an unhappy ending. It seems quite possible that the Rhesus affords an admirable example of a tragedy from the 4th century, satisfying the formal principles which Aristotle lays down for the dramatists of his own day. It has a well-constructed plot, ending in disaster. By its weakness in the study of character, it agrees with criticism which he takes on the tragedies of our younger men. It is correct in construction, but exceedingly frigid, devoid of emotional power. Athenaeus records a remark of Aeschylus that his plays were slices from the great banquet of Homer. And we may say, in turn, that the tragedies of the 5th century are slices from the great banquet of life, invested with heroic dignity and presented as a unity. The action may end in disaster or death, or it may pass through suffering to final happiness. The trilogies of Aeschylus move in a vast progression, through sorrow to reconciliation. Of the 7 surviving plays of Sophocles, 3 end in happiness or reconciliation. For the Oedipus Colonaeus, with its mysterious translation of Oedipus in extreme old age, can hardly be said to end in unhappiness. The tears which Antigone and Ismene shed are natural. The common feature of all that drama is its seriousness, its unity and isolation of action, the presence of sorrow and suffering experienced by the characters as the result of their actions. It is those actions, giving rise to sorrow and suffering, which cause the spectators to thrill with pity and fear. And here we pass the final sentence of Aristotle's definition, which has caused such endless and unprofitable discussion. A tragedy represents men acting and suffering and perhaps dying, though suffering alone is enough to rouse those emotions of pity for undeserved misfortune and fear for men like ourselves, which the successful tragedy excites. In that remark, Aristotle implies the identity or the consubstantiality of the life which actors represent with that of the audience. It is a life that differs in degree but not in kind, following the same laws and rhythm as that of ordinary humanity. Can most easily realize all that is implied in this unity of the substance of dramatic and ordinary life if we consider the relationship of an Elizabethan or modern audience to a play of Shakespeare. No one would impugn the truth of Shakespeare's representation of facts of life. The life which he depicts, it does not differ in any essential manner from that of the tragedy of 5th century BC, though its forms of it are more complicated in plot and in variety of character. But the audience feel and believe that there are other values and forces active in life of which Shakespeare takes no account. The spiritual and religious consciousness cannot be refused its right of interpretation. Though the spectator feels that the dramatist presents the facts of life as they are by themselves with convincing truth, he knows that it is not all, that there are other things in heaven and earth, by which he can interpret the sorrows of existence. Those values and beliefs, which Shakespeare disregards in the interests of his mode of dramatic presentation, may be for the spectator the most important or precious facts in life. So Shakespearean tragedy has become an artistic spectacle, taking place in a world of the artist's making, which cuts the world of daily experience, but is not concentric with it. Tragedy in the 5th century BC is concentric with life and its purposes and limitations and beliefs. Though it represents themes from a distant, heroic past, the continuity of that past, with its spectators present, and its significance for him, is accepted without question. But though there is this fundamental similarity of tragic and ordinary life in 5th century BC, it is a similarity with a difference. The difference comes from a plot, taken from the heroic life of the sacred past, from the strangeness of the costume and utterance of the characters, from their heightened capacity to act and suffer, from the employment of dance and of song. The peculiar pleasure of tragedy must reside in this union of similarity with difference, for otherwise it is hard to understand why a people should ever have come to enjoy seeing represented on the stage the sorrows and sufferings of existence. The final unity of a Greek tragedy we witness for one of the harmonious fusion of artistic and religious influences to effect what Aristotle calls at one place the appropriate pleasure of tragedy, at another purgation of pity and fear, in which we should be more inclined to call the pleasures arising from a sense of reconciliation with life, based upon a larger and clearer vision of things. In a more recent tragedy, Mr. Lucas, following Bywater and other commentators, takes the catharsis of Aristotle's definition in a medical sense as purgation or discharge of what is in excess. And the purpose of a medical purgation is to drive out an excess of offending matter in the system and to re-establish normal, healthy activity in a body. So the result is felt not as pleasure localized in any particular part of the body, but as a general sense of well-being and health. Similarly, the cathartic effect of the tragic spectacle is to purge the emotions, fear, pity, not to remove them altogether, but to reduce them so that as will restore normal emotional equilibrium and give the steadiness and security of nerve, that harmony of body and soul, which are necessary for the successful conduct of life. The effect is felt both in the theatre and afterwards as a renewal and confirmation of the individual's will to live and act and face the trials and bitterness of ordinary life. To use another medical metaphor, the tragic spectacle worked on the audience like a tonic, reviving their belief in the value of life. This purgation or tonic effect of tragedy depends on much more than a deft arrangement of piteous and fearful incidences. Aristotle insists so strongly on the primary importance of plot that one feels at times his ideal tragedy might be a little more than a well-concocted melodrama. Careful reading of his complete definition precludes such an interpretation, though the condensed form in which he has expressed himself, the brevity of his comment on some points, or his silence on what may have been, seem too obvious to need comment, render it very liable to distortion or misunderstanding. Much else beside a good plot went to produce the final effect, tragedy, for heaven's sake. Firstly, there was the tremendous, spectacular power, the impact of tragedy after tragedy with its tale of pity and fear falling upon the spectator's eye and mind. Then there was the poetic or aesthetic influence, the element of beauty in it, built up by song and dance and language, the orderly spacing of the dramatist's design into which they were woven the solemn influences, these of the heroic legend, heroic religion, so that under a spell of this art, the spectator accepted with joy amid his grief the tragic facts of the world. Such things must be, he thought. The artist proves himself by his powers of selection and of omission. And as he works, the trivial and irrelevant vanish from his theme, and the substance of life seems to fall easily and naturally into clear and inevitable form. The beginning, the middle, and the end of the action are bound together by an inner necessity. Bad fortune may pass away into happiness, prosperity may decline into suffering or death. Such things must be. Greek tragedy does not attempt to resolve the mystery of suffering. It rests upon it as an ultimate fact. It does not point towards any happy consummation of things for which creation now travails. It shows the tireless activity of man, his struggle for happiness and goodness. It teaches the necessity of misfortune, suffering, and death. Still the more higher necessity to endure such things rather than to give way to what is worse. Woe, woe, but may the good prevail, is the refrain from the chorus in Agamemnon. It is also the keynote of all Greek tragedy, and of life. Into the question why men enjoy seeing tragedies represented on the stage, Aristotle does not enter very closely. He contents himself with saying that men have a natural love of seeing things represented, even what is unpleasant or distressing, in actual life. The attraction of tragedy is the pleasure derived from seeing the representation on stage, an action which arouses feelings of pity and fear. He does not attempt to go behind this curious phenomenon, which he held no doubt to be sufficiently established by the history of the Athenian stage. Nor does he say that the pleasure derived from the spectacle of tragedy was consciously felt by the audience as a purgation of their emotions, of pity and of fear. What the philosopher expressed in the technical language of the critic as the purgation of pity and fear was no doubt felt by the mass of spectators as a strong but indefinable emotional effect. Perhaps a vague satisfaction compounded of edification and relief, in which it would not be easy for them to separate the religious and artistic influences of the spectacle. The great Dionysia was not simply a dramatic competition. It was a social and religious festival. It was a yearly celebration in which the whole people took part and possessed the mysterious and impressive power of such ceremonies. In the tragic drama created by Aeschylus and Sophocles, they found the simplest and profoundest and most enthralling of all spectacles. Simple fundamental facts of life and the theme of that drama. Action entailing happiness and unhappiness, suffering and sorrow, and joy and death. Yet here, we are at once forced to ask the further question: why did they prefer the spectacle of sorrow and tragedy to that of gaiety or comedy? Partly because religious tradition had secured the priority of tragedy, but also because their ordinary conception of life was essentially tragic. The rhythm of life in the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles is the same as that in the world of daily experience. In one of the fragments of his poetry, Archilochus encourages himself with these words, quote, "Take delight in what is delightful, and do not chafe too much at misfortune. Recognize the nature of the rhythm which sways man's life." Close quote. The phrase is a striking one and sums up briefly that view of life which recurs constantly in Greek literature and is expressed most typically in Theognis, Pindar, and Herodotus, who, writing different times for different audiences, coincide their conception of life. Theognis addresses his friend thus, quote, "Endure in misfortune, since thou hast joy of good things when fate came upon thee to have those things. As thou hast received evil after good, so now pray to the gods and seek to escape from it." Close quote. And again, quote, "Danger lies in wait upon every action, and no man knows at the beginning of a deed where it will end." Close quote. And further, quote, "No man can obtain all that he desires, for the barriers of grievous helplessness restrain him." Close quote. Similarly, Pindar, in his grand hierophantic manner, quote, "Up and down the hopes of men are tossed as they cleave the waves of baffling falsity. A short token of what shall come to pass hath never any man on the earth received from God. The divinations of things to come are blind. Many the chances that fall to men when they luck not for them, sometimes to thwart a light, yet others, after battling with the surge and sorrowful pain, have suddenly received for their affliction some happiness profound." Close quote. This is from Pindar's Olympians, book 12. And in Herodotus, finally, we read, "There is a wheel on which the affairs of men revolve, and its movement forbids the same man always to be fortunate. My wish for myself and for those I love is to now be successful, and now to meet with a check, thus passing through life amid alternate good and ill rather than with perpetual good fortune. And, finally, from Herodotus also, it is well to bear in mind that the chances rule men, not men chances. There will never be a man who was not liable to misfortune from the day of his birth, and those misfortunes greater in proportion to his own greatness. Herodotus, Book 1, line 207, Book 3, line 40, Book 7, lines 49 and 203. Such would seem to be the ordinary Greek conception of life. How it can be said to be tragic. We must of all get rid of the idea that life as tragic must end in violent death or great suffering. The practice of tragedy in the 5th century, so far as we know it, does not demand an unhappy ending, nor does it that ordinary life was lived in the same serious, large, and complete scale. It means that man has a natural delight in life and a strong spring of action in him so that he lives and acts freely. Unconstrained by the exact knowledge of his limitations, he is conscious of life as a final reality to be accepted by itself, and not as part of a wider scheme of things. The same meanings and values are attached to the facts of life for the hero on the stage and for the spectator when he has left the theatre. The curve of the tragic hero, his existence may rise higher, but it starts from the same point and descends to the same point as that of the ordinary man, and rests upon the same base, and that base is composed of simple facts of life on the earth. As they finally arrange themselves in man's mature experience, something hard and sorrowful and precarious, whose brightness is at the best short-lived, must fade into the old age as if not suddenly quenched long before the blind stroke of death. This, or something very like it, is what they meant when they say that there's the ordinary Greek attitude to life in serious moments that was tragic, and it corresponds closely to the views of life so frequently occurred in Sophocles' tragedies, which are themselves illustrated by the movements of his plays. The citizen of a modern state, enveloped in a monotonous security by an efficient service of police and taxation and public works, comforted and assisted in a peaceful career by the inventions of science and the conveniences of civilization, solaced by a religion which is not most of this world, which finds the real life in a spiritual world within the material one, is able, with difficulty, to realize how exposed to occasions of fear and pity was the ordinary life of the Greeks. The safeguards and alleviations of life, which we take for granted, were unknown to them. Society was unstable, the ways of life on land and sea were full of danger, poverty, helplessness. The weakness and sufficiency of the body to win a livelihood were no less clear to them than its inevitable decay into old age and death, or its sudden collapse from disease. Everywhere they seemed subject to circumstance or powers which are hostile and jealous. The very brilliance of Greek achievement, that austere perfection of the artistic that remains from the 5th century, helped to blind us from the conditions under which their work was done. Literature from Homer onwards contains ample evidence of all that the Greeks found to fear and pity in human destiny. Quote, "Not feebler doth the earth nurture than man, of all the creatures that breathe upon the face of the earth." Close quote. Theognis it was who calls those men fools who pity the dead rather than the living, whose life and vigour pass away so quickly. Man's boasted knowledge is but delusion. His real good or woe he is unable to foresee. Quote, "Witless are ye mortals, and dull to foresee your lot, whether of good or evil," says Demeter in the Homeric hymn. In the memorable scene after the Persian review of Abydos between Xerxes and Artabanus, who beneath their Persian names are real Greeks, Xerxes wept when he considered the brief life of the vast host gathered under his command, but Artabanus reminded him that troubles of disease, humanity made even that brief span intolerable. He comforted him thus: "Envy, factions, strife, battles, and slaughters, and last of all age claims him for her own. age dispraised, infirm, unsociable, unfriended, with whom all the woe of woe abides. And then the doom of Hades, even death at the last. Sophocles' Oedipus Colonus. Such is the catalogue drawn up by Sophocles, ending with death, the great fear of which we hear in the Phaedo of Plato, quote, that all men except philosophers count death among the great evils, and the brave who endure it only from fear of greater evils, close quote. And in accordance with this attitude, Phaedo regards it as an extraordinary thing that he did not feel pity for Socrates during the closing hours of his life, as Aristotle remarks, what men find fearful in their own case is pitiable when it appears to others. And yet this continual intrusion of fear and pity did not quench their spirit. There is something very wonderful about the steady nerve and balance of the Athenians during the 5th century. But this balance of spirit was not merely a happy gift of disposition. In the funeral oration, alluding to the religious sacrifices and festivals of the city, Pericles says that the delight we draw from these things drives away sadness or melancholy, according to Jowett's translation. To a people so occupied with making their world and living in it, so acutely conscious of the nature of human experience, so entirely dependent on themselves for power to act and endure, the spectacle of tragedy can hardly have been an only artistic or pleasurable one. Now, the expression art for art's sake would have been incomprehensible in Athens at that time, and to associate pleasure in the ordinary sense of the word with the tragedies of Aeschylus or Sophocles seems like trifling with sacred things. Aristotle, when using the word pleasure of the tragic effect, qualifies it with an adjective meaning peculiar or proper. The theme of tragedy lay much too close to the central issue of the audience's life to be regarded simply as a source of pleasure, or to be observed in the detached way that a work of art demands. Greek tragedy did not aim at the presentation of this or that character or group of persons. The spectators were not meant to detect themselves in the characters on the stage or to delight in their truth to life. To think only of the hero or heroine's character in the play, not to realize, for instance, that Creon's fortunes are as important as Antigone's in the play of Sophocles, is to fail to appreciate the significance of Greek tragedy. For, quote, it is not a representation of man, but a piece of action, of life, of happiness and unhappiness, which come under the head of action. And the end aimed at is the representation not of qualities of character, but of some action. And while the character makes men what they are, it is the scenes they act in that make them happy, or the opposite. From Aristotle. Opus Criticus. Happiness and unhappiness in this life. That's the theme of tragedy. And it is the final end of action in ordinary life. Such things belong to the deepest and most serious part of man's nature, his moral and religious conscience, in the dramatic representation of works on those feelings through the aesthetic sense to achieve for the Greek something similar to what such painters as Piero de Francesco and Giovanni Bellini do for the believing Christian. The figures and scenes of those painters are solemn and inspiring, but not with the heavenly radiance of joy of angelical saints and angels, from whom all traces of this muddy vesture of decay have vanished. The Madonnas and the saints of Giovanni Bellini, in particular, have a full and real humanity. They are also ideal in the truest sense of the world, but not in it. They have trodden the earth and know its life. They look out on the spectator with peace and power, not born of innocence and seclusion from the world, but of goodness and knowledge founded on experience. The types and scenes which Bellini creates are truly heroic and saintly, in which beauty of physical form and colour is penetrated and refined by the calmness of the spiritual strength. They have the power to uplift, to purge, to reconcile. In them, as in the greatest Greek tragedies, aesthetic and moral powers are blended together. To breathe joy in the midst of sorrow, that strange state so admirably expressed in Hölderlin's couplet on Sophocles. Viele versuchten, umsonst das Freudigstes freudig zu sagen. Hier spricht Ähnliches mehr, hier in der Trauer sich aus. The modern student may read or see a tragedy, or at the best, the Oresteia in a day, trying to make historical imagination and antiquarian knowledge to do duty for the vividness and proximity of the original spectacle. During the city of Dionysia, the Athenians sat for many hours on 3 successive days in the theatre while 9 tragedies were performed. The effect of such a performance must have been overwhelming. The modern world has nothing to offer on so great a scale. The nearest approach we can make it is the festival performances of Wagner's Ring at Bayreuth. It can be described as an immersion or saturation in the spirit of heroic life. During the performance, the audience must have felt transported into a wider, grander world than they were beheld the spectacle of human life with its sorrows and sufferings and death, its splendours, its eclipses, transfigured and redeemed from the narrow and broken perceptions of daily life by the artist's power and consecration of religion. Those 3 days constituted for the spectacular tremendous evocation of the emotions of pity and fear. Tragedy, and each one there represented in gigantic and solemn form not simply the doubtful doom of humankind, but the fearful and piteous tale of life raised to a power exceeding that of ordinary humanity. And it was by this absorption into the pitiful and fearful incidents of the heroic world that the spectator had his own emotions and pity, fear purged. His nerve, his confidence in life, shaken by his own experience of the world, is restored, or strengthened by the hero's acquiescence in and endurance of that tragic rhythm of life which pulsates through past and present alike.